This is the first saw I ever restored. It's been working quite well, considering it's the first saw handle I made. I reshaped the teeth. It's been a good user saw, but it's got a few issues, and I'm gonna correct them by making a new carcass saw. I've got a plate and a spine and this piece of stabilized quarter-sawn birch for the handle. I'm gonna start with the handle, so let's dive in. First up, I flattened it and brought it to thickness. I went for a 28mm thick blank, as I like a saw handle that is slightly wider than the more standard 1-inch. This stabilized birch planes really nicely, I think. But why stabilized? Well, if you didn't see my last video, I therein talked about it being more resistant to wood movement, which could be a great benefit for a saw handle. To test this, I took a piece of stabilized birch and an unstabilized control sample with the same area of end grain, so they would absorb moisture at a similar rate. I noted their weight and then put them in a water bath. We'll check in on them later in the video to see if the resin has any impact on the water absorption. Back in the workshop, I drew my handle shape onto the blank. I made a plywood template for this, but drawing it on paper and using that as a template works just as well. I then sawed out the shape using the bow saw I made earlier this year. Once the handle was freed from the block, I drew some lines to carve to. The handle will be fully rounded, no flats on the sides, but lines like this help with keeping it symmetrical when doing the heaviest material removal. Then I actually began by filing the front part round, because I realized I need to saw the slot for the blade before I carve away my flat reference surface. So I laid out the center line on the filed curve and sawed this with my Japanese saw, which has a kerf that most closely matches the thickness of the saw plate I bought. I then began carving the actual handle part, which I chose to do with a sturdy mortise chisel, so I can take big chips away and quickly form the rough shape. Then I used a couple of gouges to refine it. And once it was reasonably saw handle shaped, I moved on to filing to get rid of the facets. Next, I laid out a little decoration. I decided to carve a birch leaf on this part of the handle. This is a bit excessive for a tool for sure, but it's fun. I established the shape with a small gouge. Then I chip carved the veins in the leaf. Before carving, I had planned to leave it like this, but seeing it in person it just looked kinda flat, so I came back and pillowed the material between the veins for a slightly more organic look. I'm still new to this kind of carving knife, and it's interesting to work out the best grips to use and how to angle the blade. It's quite different from carving with gouge and chisel, but I do like it, and it can get into some really tight spots that just can't be accessed with my other tools. The handle is almost done, and at this point I moved on to the blade, which needs to have a corner cut so it can fit into the blade slot. I aligned the spine with the handle and took the angle of the blade slot as it compares to the vertical side of the blade. This angle was then drawn onto the plate and scored with a file. After a few strokes it can be snapped off and deburred. With the plate seated in the slot, The size of the brass back was then marked onto the handle to make a wider slot here. Once this had been cut out, I had to cut the spine at an angle to seat underneath the tip of the leaf. So I measured how big the gap was and marked this distance on the top of the brass and sawed the resulting angle. It's almost time to make holes for the bolts now. I just have to make the front section of the handle a bit thinner, because the bolts I want to use aren't quite long enough for this thickness of wood. Once the sides were flat, I also carved a pair of large chamfers. Bolt holes are next, and after deciding where they should go, I drilled pilot holes all the way through, and then countersunk the bolt heads. The through holes at full diameter were then drilled through the handle and plate at once. On a whim, I added another unnecessary detail, a little curve at the back of the plate. I've seen this done by some saw makers I follow on Instagram, and I wanted to give it a go, and it was actually very quick and fun to do. The handle was sanded with 240 grit to bring together the carved and filed surfaces, and I could then apply some finish. I chose a simple oil wax blend that doesn't darken the wood very much and has a nice soft feel after buffing. To let it dry, I placed it on a pair of thin sticks held in the vise. While the finish is drying, let's have a look at the test pieces. They've been sitting submerged for 3 days now, and the control piece without resin felt very heavy with water. And indeed, it had almost doubled in weight, from 53 to 96 grams. Then for the piece with the stabilizing resin, it was heavier at 115 grams, but then it had a much higher dry weight of 103. So the stabilized piece has taken a 12% increase, while the untreated one had a 79% increase. That's a big difference. Back in the workshop, I put the plate in my saw filing cawls and sharpened the teeth. This is a crosscut saw, so I'm following the angle lines on the cawls and skipping every second gullet to then come back angled in the other direction. And then a saw set is used to bend the teeth a very small amount, alternating directions and being careful to start on the correct one so they don't get bent in the wrong direction. I buffed the finish on the handle. Doesn't really make it shinier, but it feels a bit smoother afterwards. Then I attached it to the plate. And mixed up some slow setting epoxy for the spine. There are some different schools of thought here, should the spine be permanently fixed to the plate or not, but I haven't made enough saws to have a firm opinion on that, so I'm giving this a go after doing a glueless friction fit on my dovetail saw. Very light pressure with a quick grip clamp makes sure the plate is seated in the slot, and with a little bit of acetone I could wipe off the excess epoxy. The spine was cut to length with a hacksaw. And filed flat. Alright, so there we have it. I am very happy with how this turned out. I think it's the best saw I have made so far. I tried something a little bit different with the handle design, and I think it worked out. I think this little leaf here is quite unique. And doing this little curve here on the back of the plate was a lot of fun, and I think it adds a bit of a more refined look to it, maybe. It's kind of funny, I guess. I really swing between these two extremes when it comes to should a tool be purely practical or also, you know, ornamental. On the one hand, I make things like this where I spend absolutely no time making it look nice, and on the other hand I make things like this with a carved leaf on it and filing the metal for no reason at all. There's just something about the shapes in a handsaw that inspires me to go a little bit further and try to make it a beautiful object as well. Did I succeed or not? And does it make sense to spend this much time on a tool? I don't know, but I had fun making it, and it's gonna be an improvement, I think, over my old carcass saw. Maybe mostly because the handle is more angled down on this one and ends up almost in line with the tooth line, so that if I'm cross-cutting a wide board, the handle hits the workpiece and I can't go all the way across. That may actually be the biggest reason why I felt I needed a new crosscut saw. On this one the handle has a much higher hang angle, putting it out of the way more, so that on a wide board I can cut all the way across without the handle hitting it. I also have a thinner plate here, which makes it cut with less effort. You know, you don't have to make as much sawdust. And slightly bigger teeth, which makes it more efficient as well. The brass spine is a lot heavier than the sort of folded. It doesn't have any weight at all, and that extra weight, as it cuts, the saw is pushed down or pulled, I guess, by gravity a little bit more into the wood. And then we have the stabilized handle, which is a little bit controversial, I know, but I think for me the water experiment shows that it was worth it. It absorbed so much less water that I'm really expecting this to be far more stable throughout the seasons, and that is really important in a saw handle. You've got a section here where the grain is sitting like this, and if it wants to cup, then it's gonna bend the plate, and that has actually happened on one of my other saws, and it's very difficult to use now. You know, if you're working in an air-conditioned shop, you have perfect control of the moisture, you know that dry wood doesn't move, then no, it's not worth doing a stabilized handle, at least not if you're using quarter sawn wood, which is the most stable cut. For me, in this shed where I have wild swings in moisture, I can't trust it to be perfectly stable throughout the year, and it might bend and make the saw close to useless. It's not as much of a problem on an open handle, but on closed handles where you have much more wood in contact with the plate, it really becomes an issue. So it's one of those things that, you know, you just have to think about what your circumstances are, and is it worth it? Maybe, maybe not. For me, it is, and I am extremely happy with this saw. I think it's going to be very enjoyable to use for many years. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.